So hello, I'm Haris Doukas, and I would like to welcome you in our 11th plenary of this very interesting conference titled Energy Crisis, the Damoclean Sword over the European Economy. I know that always plenaries that are after lunch are in a way difficult, but I'm sure that with our great speakers, we will trigger discussions and the respective interests. So we have four very good experts and speakers that will discuss about all issues related with EU economic outlook, energy, subsidies, tax policies and measures, because you know that the most important impact of the current energy crisis is the cost of living that is increased all over the world, in Europe, even in other places like US, Canada. And the key issue, the key challenge is to create policies that will enable to hamper these great spices of energy spices, and this has to be done immediately and just before this winter that might be crucial for all of us. In this respect, I would like to welcome our four speakers: Ioannis Ghikas, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Greece to the EU. You can see him online. Vicente Hurtado, the Head of the Energy Taxation and other Indirect Taxes Unit of the European Commission, Belgium, also online. Hello. And then our two speakers that are physically with us today and with me, Miguel Palacios, the Professor of Management and Executive Education Association Academic and Dean of the ESCP Business School, and Adonis Yatchew, Professor of Economics, University of Toronto, and Editor-in-Chief of the Energy Journal. Thank you very much for your participation, and I would suggest to immediately start the discussion with our online colleagues from online discussions, and first with Ioannis Ghikas, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Greece to the EU. And the key issue is how can we address these energy prices and energy crisis challenges, and what are the most important policy and other measures that can help us, Greece and Europe, in this respect. So, Ioannis Ghikas, the floor is yours.
Hello, Haris, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly fine.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to give you the Greek perspective and the Greek priorities on this really crucial issue. And I hope I regret I wasn't able to be in Athens, but here in Brussels, especially with the energy issues, things are going forward very quickly. So let me just say the following. Let's begin by saying that we are in a wartime economy. The EU and its member states are subject to a hybrid economic attack. And this economic attack has been done through artificially high gas prices. And this is designed to destabilize our economies and our societies. So the questions are, what can we do on a national and EU level on this? And can we get through the winter without a dramatic spike in inflation, in budgetary deficits and widespread hardship? Now, the answer we have from Greece is yes, we can do it, and we are doing. And we are guardedly optimistic that we will achieve our objectives. Over the past few months, we have done a variety of things nationally and at EU level. We have raised our gas reserves to 86%. This should allow us to get through the winter. And according to our stress tests, even if we have negative developments such as a rise in Chinese demand or a lowering from some other exporters such as the UK of gas to the EU, we will get through the winter. But in order to be sure, what we have to do is lower gas consumption by 15%. Now, we have already agreed between ourselves, we've adopted a regulation foreseeing the reduction of gas by 15%. And quite a number of member states, Greece amongst them, have already reached this level of reduction. So we are confident we can go forward on this. Greece, on a national level, has also successfully implemented a model of taxing extremely high inframarginal windfall profits from electricity producers. And this has allowed us to subsidize vulnerable households and enterprises while using the profits from the windfall taxes so as not to have a big budget deficit. In October, for example, the subsidies are estimated to be around 1.2 billion, and we will have 1.1 billion from the extra revenues we have from the windfall profits and the others. So we do have a deficit and a budgetary gap, but it is manageable. Now, the EU on this particular issue has been slower, but we expect that on the Extraordinary Energy Council of 30th of September, we will have agreement that such measures will be taken on an EU level, while allowing member states the flexibility to do it in a way which is according to their energy model and their specificities. So this will give us overall resilience and the ability to face the challenge of this coming winter. At EU level, we've also done a variety of other things. We've agreed to reduce gas consumption, to pursue common gas purchases, and there is growing consensus to reform the electricity market in the long term so as to decouple the price of electricity from the price of gas, because this is the fundamental problem. And the package we're going to adopt on the 30th of September will ensure a de facto decoupling of electricity to gas price in the short term until we can do the long-term reform in the 2023. We've also had success in attracting more LNG. It's 60% up from last year, and it's 170% up from the United States. So are these steps enough? No. We've already agreed on some further measures. One is the new levy on windfall profits, which we will also adopt on the 30th of September, if everything goes according to plan, of course. We will also agree then to reduce electricity demand by 10%, which is a further decrease and separate from the 15% decrease of gas consumption. Furthermore, we're waiting with eagerness for the Commission to propose its action plan on Wednesday, which we understand will have three major elements. One is to ensure greater liquidity in the markets, to reduce volatility in the markets, and some measures on the pricing of gas imports. There is one missing piece, however, in all this, and the missing piece to our mind, which will enhance our resilience and ensure that we get through the winter with the least budgetary deficit and the least hardship, is a general cap on gas imports. Now, Greece and Italy, the prime ministers, Kyriakos Mitsotakis and Mario Draghi, have been advocating for this for months. But now things are maturing. We have, in the last Energy Council, we had 15 member states who were for this cap. And the rationale and the reasoning for putting it in place is becoming much more evident to everybody. And why is it more evident? And why is it reasonable to put an energy cap? Because the international gas market is not unified. You have the European gas market, which is based on the TTF. You have the American gas market, Henry Hub, and the Asian market. The European market is 3 times more expensive than the American market, and substantially more expensive. The TTF price is substantially higher than the LNG price and the Asian market price. So we have every leeway to put a dynamic cap that will be indexed on the Asian and LNG prices and will ensure that the price will not rise above a certain level, for example, 150 euros per megawatt hour, but it will be substantially higher than the LNG price and the Asian price. This way, we will ensure gas flows will continue to come through to the EU without, however, the volatility, the extreme volatility. Also, this gas price cap, because it will be done through the TTF, will not affect contracts, because most contracts are indexed on the TTF. So this is a way to reduce the price while respecting the contracts. And by the way, it also imposes a price cap on Russian gas, because most Russian contracts are again based on the TTF. So if we had done this a few months earlier, when our prime ministers were first advocating for it, the Russian war chest would be hundreds of billions of euros poorer, and our war chests, our ability to support our consumers, would be correspondingly stronger. But in any case, it's never too late. We need to do it now. Let me just finish by a more general comment. If we do handle things rightly, and we will handle things rightly, because collectively we are working very hard for this, this crisis will not affect our climate goals or our economic development in the long term. Our Fit for 55 objectives, our decarbonization objectives, have actually accelerated. Most member states have put forward through the REPowerEU plan and other measures. They have accelerated the installation of renewables, and Greece, for example, increased the share of renewables in electricity production by 20% just in the last year. And we will continue at the same rate. So we will meet and we will surpass our climate objectives. That's one thing. The second thing is because we have taken sufficient action at EU level, and building on our experience from the pandemic and the Next Generation EU and the funds we have there, we will be able to invest the necessary resources so as to ensure economic development, which is based on green, the transition to the green economy and digitalization, et cetera, et cetera. In Greece, we have 30% of our RF is devoted to green energy, and an equally substantial share is devoted to digitalization. So also, finally, let me just say that for Greece in particular, we see this crisis as an opportunity. We see it as an opportunity to diversify the sources of gas supply, to put in place the necessary gas infrastructure through the REPowerEU plan, which was politically controversial before this crisis, but gas is a necessary transition fuel. The question is, where are you going to get it from? So from the Eastern Mediterranean, we have new resources coming in, and Greece plans to become a hub for gas from the Eastern Mediterranean, but also for clean energy from places like Egypt, green hydrogen, green electricity, which we will be able to share with other member states. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very concise, and even though concise detail in the key messages, I note down that you are optimistic about the stress test of the scenarios, and even in the worst case, it seems that in Greece we will not have a significant security of supply problem. I also noted down that there are major reforms needed in Europe, and Europe is slow, so this is a good pass also for our next speaker, which is Mr. Roa, the head of the energy taxation and other direct taxes of the European Commission. And there is also one more question. Why is it so difficult to create harmonized policies, not only in terms of taxation, but also other policies that could help to minimize the cost of living difficulties of European citizens? So, Mr. Roa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harris, for the invitation, and thank you for this question. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very pleased to participate in this panel. I think that the subjects and the topics that you are raising here are really very important, and that very close to our heart, and of course to the work that we are doing. As you know, I'm responsible of excise duties, and in particular excise duties on energy products and on electricity. As part of the European Green Deal, the Commission included also a review of the Energy Taxation Directive last year, and what Mr. Ghikas was explaining before is what we are trying to do in particular with the review of the ETD. I also want to be positive, as he is. I think that from every crisis we learn and we improve and we get more resilient. And I'm also confident that despite what some people say that this crisis will end with all our interests or our policies on climate and environment, I think it will be the opposite. I think it will be a great chance to get rid of fossil fuels, to reduce the dependency. I acknowledge, as Mr. Ghikas says, that in the short term, still natural gas will be part of the transition. And this is why also in the review of the Energy Taxation Directive, we acknowledge this role. But of course, in the medium long term, we have to reduce the dependency of those fossil fuels. And that will be, of course, very positive for the environment, but also for the security and independence in terms of energy for the European continent and for the European Union in general. You ask why sometimes it's difficult to progress. I would say that we are progressing despite everything. I have to remind that in the area of taxation, and I will refer mainly to taxation issues, there is still a rule in the Council which is unanimity, which requires that 27 member states have to agree to the changes. As you can imagine, that's a big challenge. Because we are talking about countries with a very different situation, not only economic conditions, but also, of course, energy mixes and the conditions and the situation, for example, of electrification or the penetration of hydrogen, green hydrogen in the north of Europe is quite different from other countries in the south. I come from Spain, so I know the situation in Spain. They are doing a big effort in order to support and to encourage the uptake of green hydrogen. But of course, there is a big challenge before we will be getting there. I would like to pick up on one of the 3 points that you have raised for this panel, which is not surprisingly the third one, which is on taxation. And I would like to give you a bit of the overall view of the European Commission with respect to the role that taxation can play, and in particular indirect taxation, VAT and excise duties, in the transition to greener products, and also in the current situation with the energy price crisis. I'm not going to surprise anyone or to reveal nothing new that the current energy prices and the ramping inflation, which have been aggravated, of course, with the war in Ukraine, have a terrible impact on the European economy and in particular on some consumers and the industry. What is important to understand is that this is a big challenge for the governments and some administrations of member states that have to fight and strive to buffer the impact of these high energy prices on both on the households and the businesses, and in particular on the vulnerable ones. And I want to underline the fact that the vulnerable ones are the most which are hit by this current situation. For that reason, in the last month, not surprisingly, a majority of member states have lowered their taxation on energy, like, for example, introducing reduced VAT rates or reduced excise duties on energy products and on electricity. And they are also trying to make use of all the flexibilities in terms of exemptions and reduce rates below minima, which are provided, of course, in the legislation. We can understand that. I mean, taxation has an impact on the price, and of course, the first reaction, at least short-term, quick reaction, can be reducing taxes. Just as a reminder, just to let you know the situation with VAT or what is possible with VAT and with the energy taxation. In terms of VAT, the new regime that has been approved by the member states only in 2020 with respect to VAT rates allows for the possibility for member states to reduce rates to the minimum of 5% on natural gas and on electricity and district heating. That's something which is important to understand. This reduction doesn't operate or is not extended, for example, to fuels for transport. And there, of course, the standard rate has to be the rate applicable. On top of that, we have also made more flexible the possibility of applying these reduced rates. And therefore, for example, the consultation of the VAT committee is no longer needed so that member states can more swiftly or quickly implement the reduction of the rates. And that's what many member states have done. I just want to underline that, of course, fossil fuels are not part of the future, and we expect member states to reduce their dependency more and more in the coming years, and that by 2030, the reduced rates for fossil fuels, like, for example, for natural gas in the VAT, will be phased out. In the case of the ETD, as I mentioned before, we have now launched a review of the directive. The discussions are going on in the Council, and the Czech presidency is doing a great job in order to progress as much as possible. There are some complexities, like the treatment of natural gas, electricity, aviation, maritime. which are very sensitive, I know, for Greece and for other neighboring countries. But I think that we are finding ways to deal with that in the best possible way. And the ETD provides the possibility, or the ETDs, the Energy Taxation Directive, sets the minimum rates. And then, of course, member states are allowed to increase their rates as much as they want, always respecting the minimum rates, in order to make sure that they comply with these minima for the single market. But however, there are also possibilities for some derogations, like, for example, going below the minima. That's something that is only foreseen for very specific reasons. The Council has to agree to that. And I can tell you that, for example, 2 member states, Portugal and Sweden, have recently asked for a derogation to go below the minima in the case of road transport. Outside taxation, as I said before, many member states have already reduced VAT rates and energy taxation rates. Also, member states can apply other measures, and I can tell you that, for example, countries like France or Spain, they have also introduced a reimbursement of the price of the fuels at the petrol station. It's something like 20 cents and 30 cents respectively. That's different from, of course, reducing taxes, but that operates directly on the final price. The measures have been extended, and they will apply as long as the current crisis is still going on. As you can see, while it's relatively simple to introduce and to communicate reducing taxes, I have to say that the problem with these reductions across the board is that they are not targeted, and they do not take into account the different situation of vulnerable households, for example, or vulnerable industries with respect to all of them. Furthermore, we have experienced that in persistent high prices situations, the benefits for businesses and consumers are more uncertain when it comes to reduction of taxes. For example, when we reduce the VAT rates in particular, we have a lot of backtrack records in translating these lower rates or taxes into lower prices for consumers. After all, the experience says that the reduction takes place for a short term, and that after a certain period of time, the prices are increased again, and therefore the effort or the reduction of the tax is really completely offset or really watered down. Besides that, pursuing the transition to carbon neutrality will help reduce the dependency on fossil fuels, and we can only succeed if we also give a price signal with taxation and with the price. So we think that the response of the EU to the current situation and to the crisis with high energy prices has to be consistent with our overarching goals of the energy autonomy, and also with our goals for 2030 and 2050 climate targets. Mr. Ghikas referred to the Fit for 55 package. I think it's important that we keep it on track, and that it's part of the solution and it's not part of the problem. And we should not use the current crisis as an excuse in order to derail from those objectives. To the contrary, as I said before, reducing the dependency on fossil fuels, and in particular from a certain source or a certain origin, will only help us to increase our autonomy or independence, and also to reduce emissions. Therefore, our proposal here in the EU is to keep a price signal. The price signal will help us to shift from fossil fuels to less pollutant fuels, and at the same time, it will help us also to save energy. What is important, of course, is to launch a lot of campaigns to sensibilize people, households, but also the industry to reduce consumption. And there are ways to do that, of course. And at the same time, those higher revenues, because of higher prices, because of higher taxes, can be reused and can be sent back to the stakeholders who really need that, either because they are really vulnerable and they cannot afford a high bill, or because they are struggling or doing efforts in order to shift from polluting fuels to less polluting fuels. So a better way to do things is to recycle the revenues, the higher revenues from the taxes, in particular from the VAT, from the excise duty, in order to support. This can be done via reimbursements or, for example, checks But this is a good way in order to support the transition and in order also to keep the price signal. We think that targeting the support is very important, and many criteria can be used. Different member states do it in a different way. We are not trying to prescribe here, but of course, revenues, level of revenues, housing location, or quality of the households, or, for example, composition of the households. And of course, whether it's an energy-intensive industry or not, are benchmarks or parameters that could be used in order to accommodate also how this support should be done. I would like to say a few words, if I may, as complement of what Mr. Ghikas said before about windfall profit taxes. He referred to what Greece has been doing, and also it's a way to recycle revenues, as I mentioned before, we can do with the VAT revenues and the excise duties revenues. He said that we may have acted late, but at least we have acted, and I think that's something good. As you know, some member states had already decided or introduced windfall profit taxes in the energy sector, and now the Commission decided over the summer, and possibly it will be adopted at the end of the month at the Energy Council, measures in order to cover or to cater for the impact, of course, of high energy prices. And one of them, of course, is a solidarity contribution, what people call a windfall profit tax. It's not a tax, it's a contribution from the energy sector in order to help in the short term the vulnerable industry and the vulnerable households to do the transition and to go through the difficult times. The solidarity charge will fall on the difference between the benefits or the profits of the refineries and extracting companies in the EU in 2022 with respect to an average of the last 3 years, 2019 to 2021, with an increase of 20% in order to take into account particular differences per companies, and then the rate will be something around 34%. This is under discussion now. Mr. Ghikas knows because this has been discussed in the Coreper, and as we will come to the Council very soon. We hope that member states will be able to support the measure and introduce the measure as soon as possible. And we think that also what is important is not only to get the revenues, but also to recycle those revenues to make sure that the most vulnerable will profit from this. Thank you, Harris, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Really important that you underline that the short-term decisions have to be in accordance with the green agenda and the overarching objective to reduce fossil fuels, and also really important that you highlighted the need to reduce taxes in an intelligent way, appropriately, and to recycle, to targeting the most vulnerable of the citizens. So then the discussion goes to Miguel Palacios, Professor of Management of ESCP Business School, and the question is, are these things that currently being adopted efficient? Because we see strikes, we are also from two countries from the south who have great difficulties. We had also the previous period with the economic crisis. And then what about this continuously debate and discussion about the gap, the economic gap between the south and north, and the impact of this gap in this energy crisis? So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Doukas. Well, the first thing I have to say is when you give a professor the floor, is like when you give a kid the lollipop, a lollipop. You never know when you're going to get it back. But I'll try to be brief, which is what everybody says that takes long. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here, and specifically the General Conference chairs, Spiros Papathimiou and Kostas Andriosopoulos, for having me here. Then I want to organize a little bit my discourse. It's going to concentrate in the short term and in three themes. First, I wanted to talk, responding to your question, a little bit about microeconomics, then about inflation, and finally end with the policy. I mean, we had very good participants from policy talking about taxes and subsidies, so I won't go very large in that. In microeconomics, I wanted to ask you who has suffered a strike recently? Raise your hands, please. Who has suffered a strike recently? Strike in Greece recently, for example? 2 days ago. So 2 days ago, there was a strike, a transportation strike in Greece. Well, tomorrow there is in Spain a big demonstration of civil servants. Well, what you're seeing is that this energy crisis, not only the energy crisis, because there are other elements as clear winners or losers. This is an opportunity for some, but it's a very huge problem for others. I think it's been mentioned just earlier. Well, people see their electricity increase. So I was the other day at the pool and somebody said, well, my electricity bill went to 600 euros from 150. Well, for a middle-class family, going to 600 euros electricity bill in a month, it's significant. So we have also elections coming on in the southern countries, Spain, Italy, Greece, at least. So, I mean, one of the things that you will expect is certain social unrest. Okay. Is this bad? Well, in general, it's bad because having social unrest is bad. Is it good? Well, there are many opportunities. I mean, there are other players in the game that are making a lot of money. So, for example, I come from a business school, and what we saw is a huge increase in demand because people, the education is anti-cyclical. So what we are having is in full-time programs, we have huge registrations. So, I mean, if you have kids that don't know what to do, come to our business school. It's one of the best in Europe. We have very international programs that will hedge you from the risks. So there will be winners and losers, but there's, I mean, in microeconomic terms, this situation will put at unrest an important number of the population, specifically of the countries that have in Europe lower average income, which is the Southern European countries in general. And I mean, then you have some of the Eastern European countries also. This, I mean, is due to inflation. Inflation is not only based on the energy crisis. So, well, we had the COVID crisis before, global supply chains broke. So you saw an increase in prices. I mean, if you were going to buy a car, it has nothing to do with the energy crisis. It has to do with the previous supply chain crisis. Prices of cars in Europe has increased significantly because of the reduction of offer. Then the question is, I mean, if this is a supply issue, theoretically it's temporary. So it's an inflation that may have a significant impact, but once the supply issue is solved or the prices have increased, this is temporary. Well, again, this is slightly different in the north and the south of Europe, because in the south of Europe, we have in some countries high unemployment still today. In the north, I mean, there was a lot of money because interest rates were very low. Now, well, since the inflation is going up, what the central banks are doing is they are increasing interest rates. Well, increasing interest rates in Southern Europe may be a little bit more problematic than in Northern Europe. Countries in general have much higher debt levels. So the social policies that were mentioned before, when you have high debt levels, are a little bit more complicated because you have to pay the debt. Obviously, the European Union is doing things to try to solve this situation, in that these countries don't suffer as much, and there is this big dispute between northern and southern countries on how to deal with the inflation, whether we should increase interest rates, to which levels, because this causes problems with the society. So we have a situation of inflation that may be temporary, but the prices may increase definitely. The population, some of the population is suffering. So what can governments do? And this is the third point. And what can companies do? So what can you do? Well, I think the European Union and the governments are trying its best to lower taxes. So, I mean, yesterday, I think it was announced in Spain that the taxes that were mentioned were down to 5% on gas already. Then subsidy schemes will be put into place. I mean, in some of the southern European countries, it's not an issue of security of supply. Spain has regasification plants. I mean, theoretically, for the whole of Europe, we are not connected. So it's not an issue of security of supply, it's an issue of price. So one of the things that, I mean, I think politicians will be under huge stress in the coming months. And people here that are from companies, well, they have to organize for a roller coaster. Okay, we've been going through a roller coaster in the past days, but they have to organize for changing situations, changing policies, sudden movements, trial and error situations that affect this energy crisis, affect a potential economic crisis in Europe, and affect also, I mean, we were commenting it with one of the people seated in the room before. Well, in the past, we had, let's say, three main providers of goods and services and technology as Europe, and we were perhaps the fourth one. So we had the US on one side, we had China, and then for some things we had Russia. Well, this has changed. So this is changing also the geopolitics. This is changing also the vision of Europe. So my message is, from an organizational standpoint, get ready for a roller coaster. A roller coaster can be bad, and a roller coaster can be good, depending on how well you are prepared for this situation. I think I'm close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this roller coaster comment, I think we can continue with discussing more with another professor, Professor Yatchew, and then the question is how things happen and we are in front of a roller coaster. What went wrong, and if can we even now address all these issues? Difficult, but please.
Thank you. So I'm the only non-European on this panel, and feel honored to be participating. I'm from Canada. We have experienced increases in oil prices and therefore gasoline and diesel prices. Those have been coming down. Some increases in natural gas prices, little effect on electricity prices, at least not where I live. So we have experienced nothing like the turmoil, economic and political, that you are experiencing in Europe. So I am truly heartened when I observe and listen to the response that I see in Europe. Democracies are messy. They've been sometimes described that it's like making sausage. You don't want to see how it's done, but you're prepared to eat it at the end. It often involves all kinds of unholy compromises within a democracy. Now you've got a group of democracies. It gets even much messier. So the unity that I'm observing, and yes, from your perspective, maybe you're seeing a lot of differences and a lot of disunity, but the unified response, both from the economic perspective and from the political and military perspective, I see as very heartening. Now, prices are very high in Europe for natural gas, of course, and electricity. And one of the quips that economists sometimes make is that the best cure for high prices is high prices, because innovation brings about change, substitution, and so forth. But what an innovation, acceleration of of implementation of decarbonization program has been mentioned, in fact, was articulated very clearly within 2 weeks of the beginning of the war. But where I am most hopeful is that the acceleration will occur in innovation. Why? Because innovation of decarbonizing technologies. And I say that because what concerns me in the big picture is not that Europe will be somehow unable to meet its targets. I'm confident they will. I'm much more concerned about the ability of the emerging economies to adopt technologies, to hit tipping points on technologies that are sensible for them, that are practical for them, and that are even feasible for them. That may very well be one of the outcomes of this terrible period that we're experiencing now. Now, let me just take a few steps back and how did we get here? And I'd like to address a narrative that's been out there for quite some time, for as long as 30 years. Let me just summarize it with a phrase. It's don't poke the bear. Don't poke the bear because the bear is going to react. So what do we observe after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Within a few years, more than a dozen Eastern European countries joined NATO, getting closer and closer to Russia. Some have argued that had NATO not expanded so quickly and had we in the West helped Russia democratize, then it would have come along better. It would have developed democratic liberal norms. Let me suggest a powerful counter-argument to that narrative. Economics is an imperialistic social science. We have much to say about pretty much anything you want. Politics, geography, we've expanded. And I think at times we pay insufficient attention to our colleagues in, for example, political science. So we have something called the Dutch disease that we've studied for years, and there's plenty of empirical work documenting the idea that countries that focus on the exploitation of major resources do not modernize, do not industrialize as quickly. I don't need to expatiate on that argument here. But political scientists actually have an analogous type of argument, except it doesn't apply to modernization, it applies to democratization. And the argument goes something like this. Countries where the ruling elites are able to extract a large portion of their revenues from commodity rents don't have to engage in, and I'm going to use a political science term, in the revenue bargaining process. Revenue bargaining is the idea that the ruling powers, the government, has to give voice to the population, has to provide them with services, has to provide them with certain freedoms, and in return, they get revenues. The population is willing to pay taxes. That revenue bargaining argument is weakened if most of the revenues, or a substantial portion of the revenues, come from resources like, in this case, Russian resources, oil and natural gas. And there's a large empirical literature on this in political science. I recommend a book by Michael Ross, 2012. I believe it's entitled something like The Curse of Oil. And what it essentially argues is this in great detail with lots of empirical support, is that when these resource revenues are appropriated by a small group and can be appropriated by a small group, it becomes much more difficult to bring about democracy. So I'm much less willing to accept the argument that somehow the West and the expansion of NATO caused the circumstances in Russia and its invasion of Ukraine, which is now in its 8th year. It's a hot war now, but it began in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea, and we don't know where it will end. So that's some of the perspective that I would suggest that we think about when we look at what are our hopes for the future. I'm sure I could say more, but I don't want to take away time from my colleagues here. So thank you for this.
Thank you very much. Hopes and fears, many fears also, I understood. So we have just 5 more minutes maximum, so I don't want to say anything more. I would like all of you to give you a final opportunity for a statement, a final statement. Maybe it could include also the $1 million question, when do you think this will over the energy crisis? But I leave it up to you. We can start as we started with Ioannis, Ghikas, and then Mr. Roa, Professor Palacios, and Professor Yatchew.
Yeah, so thanks, Haris, and thanks to the other speakers for their interesting comments. Very briefly, I did not want to sound optimistic by undervaluing the economic hardship that we are going through, especially in Greece, where we've gone through the pandemic and 10 years of economic crisis. The main message is that we are working to make this hardship as low as possible. And for example, with electricity prices, these measures that I described allowed us to keep the rise in electricity for the average household. I'm not sure of the number, but let's say it's 30% higher than last year, whereas without the measures that we have taken, it would be 8 times higher, it would be 800% higher. So we are doing what we can, and that is another reason why we need drastic measures such as the price cap. An interesting comment on unity and solidarity of the EU when seen from across the Atlantic. I think that our European newspapers and the media like to say that we have bigger divisions than we have. What I see in the Council is a common determination to find a way forward and ensure that our citizens are protected. Just a comment that the problem with the gas price is not a problem of supply. It's a problem of how the markets are organized and the way that the Russians are manipulating our markets. And as for the roller coaster, we've gotten used to the roller coaster over the pandemic years, and it does work both ways. So thanks a lot for that.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Roa.
Thank you, Haris. A very interesting and fruitful discussion today in this panel. I feel really honored of participating in this panel. I will be very short because I think I said the main messages before and you summarized very well after my intervention. Our response, or the response of member states or the governments and administration of member states, have to be efficient and effective, has to be coherent with our main goals in the short, long, and medium and long term, and they have to be equal, or they have to respect the principle of equality. So taxation is part of the solution. Taxation can be a powerful tool to reach our goals, and we should not lose track of that.
Great. So efficient response and efficient answer also. 30 seconds if possible. Thank you.
I tend to be optimistic. So I hope the Ukraine war ends soon and we solve the energy issues soon. So we'll still be on the roller coaster because of the inflation and the prices. But just be ready to change. The future is where we are all going to live in. Adapt and change.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. So somewhere at the very beginning of my energy courses, I talk about what are the 4 major challenges facing humankind. Decarbonization. My comment on that in this context is I'm hoping for acceleration of innovation. The second one is retreat of democracy and the rise of autocracy. The jury's going to be out on that one for a while, but so far I'm heartened by what I'm seeing in Europe. The third one is nuclear proliferation. I see a downside, serious downside to that. After the abrogation of the Budapest Memorandum, I cannot believe that, because Ukraine did have nuclear weapons and gave them up in return for security guarantees, I cannot see a country like North Korea or Iran or any other country interested in getting nuclear weapons all of a sudden retreating and say, no, we'll accept some security guarantees in exchange. So there's a major downside to that. Unfortunately, the fourth one, which is a perennial one, is global poverty. The current circumstances aren't going to help that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and looking forward to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.